Yeah, are you seeing the PowerPoint on your screen? Okay, well good morning to everybody there. I want to thank all of you, Karen and everybody else that helped out to put this together. Looking forward to, this is my first time as well doing a presentation online, so it's exciting at the same time as just simply exciting to talk about language access and the available resources and the obstacles that come up that we all encounter when addressing issues of language access. So a little about me. I don't know if I couldn't hear earlier what was said already, but as mentioned, my name is Kleber Palma. I'm the director of the Translation and Interpretation Unit for the New York City Department of Education. And what I'm going to talk about today, hopefully, is relevant to your areas and some of the challenges you may be encountering as you address issues of language access. Specifically, I want to focus on the translation side of things, so that the written translation, the documentation aspect of language access. So the following presentation is going to be based on identifying vital documents to translate into how many languages and how to determine that. And also we'll address issues of quality control and some proactive steps you can take during the process. And at any time, do feel free to interrupt with questions or comments. And I think the best way is for me to see your hand go up because the audio is not that great. So if I see someone's hand go up, I will pause and allow for questions, and I'll be glad and happy to answer at that point. Okay? All right. So one of the things that, just to start off, and to begin to address the issue, the translation needs of your organization is coming up with the definition of vital documents. This term is used throughout the process of translating materials for limited English proficient individuals. The term vital or the term critical are interchangeable in most of these conversations. And it's a challenge to really, if you really sit down and start thinking about what is considered vital or critical. It's something that does take some time. It does take some conversations and dialogue with your, with others in your organization to identify what's in, what's out. In an ideal world, everything would be translated, but given limitations and resources, some tough decisions need to be made. So the issue of vital needs to be, or critical needs to be addressed up front. So this is one of the biggest challenges when moving forward to try to devise a plan or a language access plan to determine how much can be done either proactively or reactively in the translation process. So as the screen says here, what one person may consider vital, another may not, or vice versa, depending on the perspective and the use of the document. So I see that a lot. And that happens in all sorts of city government in terms of what's in and what's out. Another challenge in assessing translation needs moving forward is where to draw the line when it comes to what languages to translate materials into. In most diverse communities or cities, there are dozens and dozens of languages. Here in New York City, for the Department of Education, we're dealing with over 170 languages that are represented. And after coming back from my visit to Hawaii several months ago, I came back much more knowledgeable in the diversity that affects your communities in Hawaii. So the difficult challenge is where you draw the line. Do we say the top 3 languages, 5, 8, 12? And there's always going to be languages that are on the other side of the fence when it comes to what proactively can be done and what cannot be. One of the other things that adds to this issue is that some organizations do a very good job in collecting language information from their clients or from their communities, whether it be what language is spoken at home or whether it be what language you prefer to have communications in. In collecting that data, that's why I can tell you we have 170 languages here, but in collecting that data, again, it adds to the difficulty of where do you draw the line. So here in New York City for the Department of Education, we have it at 9 languages. And we have reasoning behind that, but there are 161 languages we don't support proactively. So I'll get into what can be done to help you overcome these challenges as you come up with the best plan of attack, or otherwise known as a language access plan. One of the things that I have found very useful in trying to address issues of translation coming up with the language access plan is taking a look at what you see on the screen right now, what I call a 5-factor assessment plan to take a look at how best to approach the issue of translation. And I'm going to get into each one of these sections in some detail in the following slides. But as you can see, the organizational structure of your entity, your agency, is something I'll get into. The type of interactions that you have with LEP individuals, the universe of documents, again, going back to our conversation of vital, non-vital, or critical, non-critical. And how many resources, what resources do you have? And we'll talk a little bit about your options and some of the things you may have in place, or maybe you don't, and that will help you determine which route to pursue given the other factors on this pie chart. And lastly, what I'm considering proactive languages. Again, drawing that line in the sand in terms of saying the top X amount of languages we're going to do proactively. And that can get you a piece of the puzzle in addressing language access for translation purposes. So to begin, the first thing that we're going to talk about is the organizational structure. And what that basically means is taking a look at your government agency, the agency you represent or work within, and taking a look at how it is organizationally structured so that from a language access perspective, so that you can get a better sense of how big of a problem or how big of an issue or how big of an obstacle you have in front of you for addressing translation needs. So one of the scenarios that your organizational structure could fall into is simply that you represent one physical central office that takes care of whatever social service or medical service that you're responsible for, but there's one building, one physical building. And if that's the case, and if that describes your organizational structure in the best fashion, then there's one approach that you may want to consider moving forward. So in this case, in identifying that you do have one central location, this obviously allows for a centralized translation support and the archiving of translation. So it allows you a lot more control to organize yourself, to identify documents, to archive them, and to provide the support centrally. Designate one individual or an office to support and train and give guidance to others in the organization to support translation services. So this is probably the cleanest and easiest in terms of just how to respond to this piece of the pie is just taking a look at whether this best describes your situation and if possible, allow for the appointment of a coordinator. Typically what I've seen is that, and it's happened to many people that I run into, is that whoever is hired to do a primary job gets tasked to do a secondary job, which is language access coordinator or the processing of language access services. And that's difficult because there's so much to do, and in many cases, that language access coordinator person is almost a full-time job in itself in many cases. But so that pretty much describes that scenario. The second scenario, in terms of the organizational structure, is and this is true in other larger settings, is when there are multiple field offices. And I think the only thing I can relate to in terms of my experience in Hawaii is that if you had your agency is represented on all the islands separately, so there'd be several, what the slide says, field offices or different buildings in each office, in each island, for example. And this kind of it may add a layer of complexity in terms of how to address language access. So no longer is there just one central location for support. You now have multiple places that may require each location to have a point person to address their local needs. Because there's more than one person involved in different places, it means you're not talking about additional training, establishing a protocol and making sure everybody in each one of the field offices understands how the process works. And also, it also adds a layer of what I'm calling local or minor languages. So if you're talking about one central office and you're talking about language data, it could be comprehensive in terms of the entire state or the entire geographical area that you're covering. However, if you're talking about multiple locations and an office at a satellite office in a different location, there could be a larger presence of a local or minor language that wouldn't be on the radar if there was only one central office representing your agency. So in the case of, in this scenario, if there are several places, a language that is relevant in a field office may not be as relevant on the central, at the central level. So it adds the complexity that you may not need to respond to that local need of those local languages. An example that I can bring up in terms of what happens here with the school system, as I mentioned earlier, we proactively covered 9 languages, which those 9 languages do not include a language like Albanian. It does not include a language like Polish. However, you can go to a school in certain communities where it have a highly dense population of those languages, of those communities, and they have had to, that school or that district office have had to come up with ways to address those language needs that here centrally we do not account for in the top 9. So that could be something that could be the case in your area as well. Any questions so far?
What are the 9?
The 9 languages are in alphabetical order because that's how I've memorized them. Arabic, Bengali, Chinese, French, Haitian Creole, Korean, Russian, Spanish, and Urdu. So you have those 9 languages plus English, so a total of 10 languages, and we're talking about it almost 95% of our population. And the other 160 represent the other 5%. And that's a factor that, I'll talk about a little bit later that will help you determine, where to draw the line as well, given your limited resources. Okay, so the second part of the initial graph that I showed you was to identify the type of interaction that you have with limited English proficient clients. And if you only take a snapshot of that interaction and focus on that, it'll bring some things to light, and it'll make things much more clear in terms of what kind of response is required by your agency or your entity to respond to translation needs. So I've listed here 3 typical scenarios of types of interactions that you may have with LEP clients. But there could be more, or there could be a combination of these, depending on the type of service you're providing the community. So just to go through them, the first thing listed is on-site visits. So what that means is you work for a government agency where people come to you. They walk in your front door, and they seek assistance by going to your facility. If that describes you, then by default, you need to consider having obviously multilingual signage because you have people walking in your front door. So at a bare minimum, you must have some sort of signage in multiple languages, either directing them to someone who can support them in those languages or someone who is knowledgeable on how to access language access services or over-the-phone services or whatever you may have in place, or to bilingual staff. Also, if this describes you and your entity, then you also will want to have readily available documents and forms that are handed out to people visiting, LEP individuals visiting your facility. So right off the bat, you have signage, and you have, whether it be intake forms, enrollment or registration forms, or informational brochures or pamphlets. Those are the types of documents that you should be primarily focusing on to start addressing the issues of translation and what documents to translate. The second scenario, what's described as client-specific communications, and what that means is if you're the type of entity that sends out specific letters tailored to specific individuals and are mailed out, for example. So you have either form letters or you have letters that have specific information that is only related to an individual that it's intended for. If that's the type of communication or interaction you have with LLP clients, then you will need to address the issue of translating documents with this specific client data or using form field and somehow. So these client-specific communications, I'll use a form letter example, for example, and if these things get mail merged and get sent out, you will probably need to know whether or not that individual has a language preference other than English, and have those documents ideally translated and sent to the individual in their language preference. These form letters would need to have whatever specific information for that client also translated, which creates another set of issues to overcome. But if that is the type of interaction that you mostly have, then that is something you possibly need to address rather quickly. The third scenario is probably a lot simpler than the second scenario. General outreach to the community in general. So no longer are we talking about a specific letter going to a client, but rather just general information about upcoming events, about a new program that's available or a new service that's available that is directed to the entire community you're servicing. If that's the type of interaction that you have, then we're looking at translating newsletters, informational bulletins, maybe calendars, those type of materials, so that they get sent to everybody. If you have language preference data beforehand, then you can send the Chinese version to the Chinese-speaking family, or the Mandarin-speaking family, for example. If you don't have language preference data already, then perhaps creating bilingual versions of these documents is the way to go. If space permitting and formatting issues permitting, where you would have English on the top and Spanish on the bottom, something to that effect. But it would just be generic text that you're translating. So that would be that approach. And if you have a combination of these three scenarios, or a scenario that's not listed on that, you think it through, because the concept behind this idea that's being presented here is for you to think through the type of interaction, so you can try to determine what it is that you need to be focusing on first before other things. Okay? Questions? Okay.
Not yet.
Okay. Okay, so the third part is identifying the universe of documents. This goes a little bit back to our conversation about vital documents, and one of the things that I have found helpful is to come up with a way to organize or categorize the documents that fall within your jurisdiction. One of the ways of doing so is to perhaps use what's listed here as a starting point, but do tailor these to however it fits better to your model. What you have in front of you here now is 5 to 6 categories that we've come up with, but again, like I said, they may not be applicable to you, or there may be additional ones. It's just a matter of getting you to think this through. And once categorized, you get a sense of how big of a universe of documents you have, and how many resources you need, and then you combine that with the number of languages and the number of clients. But to stick to this point is to get a sense. It also gives you an idea of what to work on first. For example, the item listed there is frequently used or frontline documents, which came up before in me speaking about having LEP individuals visit your facility, having forms available, informational brochures, flyers. So these are the most common documents, the most useful, the ones that are widely spread out through the community and are very informative. The second type of document, the second category listed here, are those types of documents that are only used during certain times of the year. Whether you have an event in the summer or in the fall and you do it every single year, if you can calendar that, and you can map your year or use existing calendars and just tack to the language needs to whatever documents are created for those events. It's another way to identify the documents you need translated and to do it beforehand with ample time. Not only can you plan ahead for these seasonal documents, but you can use them every year. If you create them in a way where they can be recycled, the translations can be recycled, and it's just a matter of updating dates or location or other logistical information, you can save yourself time and money by recycling translations once you've determined that you're going to be using or conducting these events on a periodic basis. The third item listed there is long-standing policy documents. This one's a little bit tricky. This talks about policies and procedures. Some people call them standard operating procedures manual. These documents typically are very lengthy and they're sometimes very technical, and to be frank, they're sometimes very boring. But they're critical to have translated in case an issue comes up with a client of yours, so that policy and the procedures are understood by all. This being that they are typically longer documents, they're also not updated as often. So this could be a one-time investment of resources to get these policy documents translated, because typically policies don't get changed that often. So it wouldn't require constant updating. But this is another category that if you start thinking about it in its terms, you can come up with several documents under this category that you should be considered for translation purposes as well. The next item is signage. That is goes without saying. If you have visitors, clients, LEP clients visiting you, signage is a must. I have seen places where locations where there's an English sign, whether it be go to the front desk or welcome or take a number, and then there's 9 translations next to it. So the wall is filled with signs, which is something we want to avoid as well. One of the things that is what we promote heavily here is when creating a new English sign, make it a multilingual sign. So instead of posting it 10 times, in our case, because we have 9 languages plus the English, we push for the redesign of the English flyer, make it larger, make it a poster size, throw in all 9 languages there, and you have one sign on the wall instead of 10. That one sign has the message in all 9, 10 languages. And there's also some cost reduction in terms of printing and other factors as well. So take that into consideration when we talk about signage in your facilities. Websites. Websites is now a very popular thing to have translated, but very difficult and also very expensive. Websites can be very dynamic in nature, meaning that they're constantly updated. There's a lot of features where there's updates and there's headlines flashing all over the place with new news and new programs. If you attempt to have similar translated websites that are constantly updated to match the English, you will realize that it is a huge endeavor to do so. So by all means, if you can keep foreign language translated websites up to date, fantastic. But another way to approach it is to allow the English website to continue to be live and dynamic and constantly updating, but only offer on the foreign language websites static text, or text that does not require constant updating. This could be policy-driven documents or information that is extremely helpful, a blurb about special programs or services being offered by your agency that do not change very often, and doing so will allow you to have those translated websites online and applicable for a very, very long time. And the last item there is pretty much everything else. But it's good to know that there's everything else out there. There's always, and maybe you can probably relate to this, is the last-minute rush document that gets created, the last-minute rush translation that needs to get done. So that falls under everything else, or the unexpected. It's good to keep that in mind, because if you're developing a budget based on what's listed on the screen, you need to account for the unexpected. Okay, I'm moving on to the next slide. Okay, so identifying proactive languages. How can my agency determine what languages to support? This is somewhat tricky as well, and I mentioned unknown languages and the percentage of the population it covers and so forth. But there are a few things you can take a look at to determine how far you can go proactively. It doesn't mean that other languages will not be supported. It just means that they will be supported by another means. So one of the things to take a look at are federal, state, local mandates, what they require. Sometimes these mandates are very specific, where they state top 6 languages, top 9 languages, and sometimes these mandates are filled with vague language where they fill in when feasible, when reasonable. It's important to understand what applies to you and to understand what can and cannot be done given the mandates. In addition to government mandates, there are also field-specific mandates. I know the medical field is much more advanced, probably, in addition to the court system, much more advanced than the education field and other city government in terms of language access requirements. But being familiar with those will help determine what the expectations are for everybody. Another thing you can take a look at is the percentage breakdown of your service population. Now, this assumes, of course, you have language data with you to take a look at. You can begin with government census data as a starting point. That'll give you a picture of the city or the state as a starting point. But I think it's important to point out that you may want to take a closer look at the actual service population because it may vary from just general census information, whether it be that we're talking about schools, or the medical field, or housing, or whatever the case may be. The breakdown may be different in the census data. If you don't have language information or data for your service population, it's probably something you want to put to the top of your list in terms of, if you have a to-do list, that's something you want to start taking a look at because that will help you answer a lot of questions and will help you develop the best possible language access plan that you can. The next bullet, consider, okay, so this goes back to our conversation about the local or minor languages. It's important to just keep these in mind. And wherever you draw the line in terms of what languages you're proactively translating, it's important to note what languages you are not, and you're leaving out of the mix proactively. And whether or not you can come up with a plan to address some of those or all of them. Whether it be by allowing individuals to make requests by another means. In my case, in my previous example, we have means to have schools address their Polish population or their Albanian population. Again, 2 languages we do not do proactively. So just keep that in mind. And ultimately, and the last point that's mentioned there is consider level of available funding, if there is funding, right? In many cases, these mandates are unfunded mandates in some situations, and in some cases, there are means to identify funding within certain statutes and mandates to earmark funding specifically for language access. So if you have a pot of money and you have these other bits and pieces of the puzzle, the picture will become clearer in terms of what can and what cannot be done. Right? Show of hand, how many of you have funding for language access? It doesn't surprise me.
What is the federal mandate now?
I'm sorry?
What is the federal mandate now?
Well, the federal mandate, their guidance is that they have you take a look at a similar model that I'm showing you here, but their model talks about, I think there's 4 categories, and it talks about what's reasonable, and it talks about how much of the percentage of the service population that it would be affecting if you did or did not provide services. So they give you some guidance, and it's filled with reasonable, feasible language that gives you the opportunity to to come up with a plan to be as responsive as possible given limitations. I think the government understands that every agency cannot translate things into 170 languages. So they only provide guidance in developing a plan and pursuing that. There is no top 5 languages that I'm aware of on the federal level. So I think identifying translation resources. So this goes back to the funding piece, which I saw no hands go up in the air when I asked that question, and didn't surprise me. But it's an important thing that we need to talk about is what kind of resources do we have in place, or can we have in place? How much of a lift are we talking about after we do this assessment? How many people are we affecting? And how many languages are we looking into? So the other piece is who's going to do the work. Once we come up with what our game plan should be, what resources do we have available to actually do the work? And a few of the things that I have listed here are some of the options that are available, and it ultimately be you or your agency to determine what is the best option for you. The most common response in terms of what resources are available is contracting with translation companies or translation vendors, or these are, you may be familiar, I'm sure you are. These are companies that offer language services in possibly all living languages. They have networks of freelance interpreters and translators around the world, and they're a one-stop shop where you can send a document and ask it to be translated in X number of languages, and you get it back at cost, obviously. So that's one way of doing that. The other option is hiring full-time employee translators, which is something that we do here, in addition to having a contracted translation company to support our needs. So if you had a translations department, or if you had a language access department, not only are you talking about making sure frontline staff know what the requirements are, but you could also be talking about having full-time staff of translators to address those needs. So some agencies do this. As I mentioned, we do. I know that the FBI has their translations department. I know other school systems that do as well. So there are certain, the UN obviously does. So there's some agencies and some organizations that do have in-house staff. But that doesn't mean that may be the answer for you or your agency. Another popular option is using bilingual staff. So in many cases, a lot of the employees hired speak a language other than English, and are used in many cases to translate or to serve as interpreters, whether they're certified or knowledgeable, or whether or not they're capable of it are other issues to address. But it's being done every day where bilingual staff is used to help accommodate language access needs that come up. And the last one is a variation of the third bullet point. So in the third bullet point, what that describes is one entity, one building having bilingual staff addressing the needs that come up within that building. The fourth bullet refers to a chain of satellite offices or field offices that work together to identify bilingual staff at any one of those locations or any one of the islands. And if bilingual staff is identified in all different locations, they can be used for needs that show up at other locations. So you're pretty much sharing resources. You're not just limited to staff that is housed within your facility, but you could also have access to bilingual staff in other sister offices or other facilities that fall within your agency as well. So that's why it's the network of system-wide bilingual staff. That's what's meant by that. That is something that we see here in New York City as well. There are networks that are created. There's a database of volunteer translators and interpreters that city agencies can tap into within different agencies to make use of bilingual staff. So that seems to work. It's all obviously on a volunteer basis. And again, there's issues of quality can still be a concern. And as I wrap up this slide, and all of the above, all these that I just went through, definitely have their pros and cons. I mentioned the issues of quality regarding bilingual staff, the expensive rates of translation companies, the expensive cost of housing in-house full-time translators. They go on vacation, there's no one to translate. So these are the things that, if you really want to take a look at one of these options, consider all the pros and cons to each one of them and see what best fits the needs that you have at your end for identifying resources. So as a continuation of that last piece of the pie in terms of having resources, I also thought it would be a good idea to talk a little bit about the quality concerns or the quality issues that come up with translation as an extension to that last piece of the pie that we went through. So up until now, we've discussed those 5 components, things that some of those may be relevant to you and some of them may not be, or a combination of them could be relevant to you. But taking a look at the issue from those perspectives will give you a better sense of what the actual need may be and what may need to be addressed. But in terms of moving forward, though, with the presentation, I thought I'd sneak in a couple slides in here about translation quality and a few things and suggestions and things you can do beforehand or you can do already to help minimize issues in the long run. So when dealing with translation quality, it's kind of a tricky issue. The issue of translation is very subjective. It's a combination of both skill and art. Translators are very skillful and knowledgeable in terms of the terminology, the research that's involved, and professionalism, but it's also an art form. And though it may be an accurate translation, I may not like it because I don't like the art. And that is the type of issue that comes up constantly in the translation world. And it's very difficult to have people understand that the translation may be accurate, it serves its purpose, let it go, but in many cases we want to put in our 2 cents and we want to change this and we want to change that. And it's a never-ending back and forth that causes delays and other issues as well. So in trying to minimize those incidents, what I had listed on the slide are a few suggestions that will help reduce the amount of back and forth, and it will help focus on quality issues that do merit time, that should be focused on. And the quality issues that should be focused on are true errors, real mistakes. If the English says we have a meeting on December 6th and the Russian says December 12th, that's a mistake, and those are the things that we should be focusing on. If the English document has 7 bullet points and the Arabic version has 6 bullet points and there's something missing, that's a mistake. Those are the things that we should be really be focusing on, and we shouldn't really be focusing on whether or not we should call an item a car or an automobile, which is something that happens a lot in terms of quality issues that are raised. So the things that you have in front of you now are a few suggestions to take into consideration when dealing with translation. And these are the types of things that you could begin to be working on already and at very little cost. So the first thing is establishing a foreign language style guides. And what that basically means is in each language that you're working with, coming up with a style guide that a group of people or a cohort or bilingual staff within your organization are happy with and will follow. Whether that means to leave office names in English or translate office names or put it in both English and Spanish. These are the types of decisions that could be made up front so that when translations are done by others, they'll have some guidance as to how to address some of these things that come up constantly. Do we translate titles of individuals? Do we translate acronyms, or do we keep acronyms in English because that's how they're known by the general public? And other items, those types of issues that come up. You can take a look at English style guides. Many communication offices media relation offices, they have English style guides, or offices within your agency that are responsible for creating communications in English. In some instances, they have style guides. Take a look at those, and that'll give you some guidance, an idea of what should and could be done in other languages to avoid long-term issues of or complaints of translations. Doing so also, as the slide mentioned, it just improves overall consistency, regardless of who is actually doing translation. So if I'm following the style guide and I produce a translation, and somebody else does a translation 2 weeks from now, but they also follow the style guide, the work should be somewhat consistent in terms of the quality. The second goal is creating bilingual glossaries. So this is very similar to the first bullet point. If we were to come up with a list of key terms that are relevant to your agency in English, to begin with, just in English, whether they be program names, names of services, again, office names, titles, and we would translate those into any language that you wish, and we all come to an agreement that that's how we're going to translate these key terms that appear over and over and over again, then we pass that on to translators, whether they be in-house translators, bilingual staff, vendor, contracted translators, and we ask them to use these terms forever or until they're changed and updated. This will give you a consistent translation. Again, there may be some other grammar issues that you cannot control given who's doing the work, but at least the message will be consistent. And it will also minimize potential feedback, because if someone comes back and says, I don't like the way you translated director, you can say, well, given our glossary, we made the call many years ago that director was going to be translated this way, and we've been doing so since day one. So it's another tool that could be created. And like I said, this is something that could be created beginning now, just by listing some English terms. In some organizations, I know that there are publications that contain glossary terms as an addendum to an existing publication. That could be a starting point for creating a bilingual glossary, is using those glossary of terms in English and just getting those translated. So. Also, creating proofreading guidelines is important, because it gives the person giving the feedback some guidelines to follow. I've seen in many instances that a document was translated into a foreign language and it comes back highly edited with comments and scribbles, and the general consensus is that it's a horrible translation. And when you take a look at it, what the person did, they added text, they added a paragraph because they thought it would make more sense in the foreign language. They deleted a few things, they changed other things. So those types of changes, additions, deletions, are not part of the role of a proofreader. The proofreader needs to understand, or someone who's doing a translation needs to understand, they need to have the English along with the translation and do a comparison, because the translator's role and responsibility is to be as faithful as possible to the English, to keep it at the same register level as well. That's what they have to do. If the person reviewing the document feels that the register is too high in Japanese, well, the question should be raised to how the English was written. And if there are issues of register, then the English needs to be brought down before the Japanese translator can bring the register down in the Japanese version. So proofreading guidelines, it sets parameters for unsolicited third-party reviewers, which comes up very often. And since some of us speak one or at the most two or a limited number of languages, we don't speak them all. We're dependent, and we don't have any say when an Arabic translation comes my way and they say it's horrible. I don't speak Arabic, so I don't know what to go by. So it's very difficult to determine whether or not there is any validity to their comments and feedback. But if we give this individual some guidelines, some rules to follow, then that document may not come back as being as bad as they first thought it was. The last item here that you could consider moving forward is that if indeed you do develop some sort of process to translate documents, whether it be in-house or externally, and whether or not you do establish style guides and glossaries and proofreading guidelines, if you come up with a system in place to get documentation translated, you want to make sure that you identify those translations having gone through this process. It's important because if something comes back down the road with a translation issue, it will be easy for you to tell anybody that that translation came from this process, it was worked on by certain individuals, or if it did. Here at the Department of Education, the translations unit, we do a lot of translation work for the schools, but we do not do it all. We can't do it all. There is a ton of work that we just simply cannot do because of our limited resources. So schools do a lot of translations as well, and that's fine. But again, we can't vouch for the quality of those school-based translations. So what has happened in the past is we have had some feedback from the community saying that, translation was horrible, it was, filled with mistakes. And if we're able to see that document with the comments of it having mistakes, and we can easily identify whether or not it came through us or not, it can save us a lot of time of going back and forth as to where it came from and why the quality is so poor. So the way we identify our translations is that we simply put a label on the footer of all of our translations that identifies it. So we track our translation jobs that come through here. We give it a tracking number. It goes through our process that we've established here. And at the end of the process, the translations will have this number on the bottom left-hand corner that identifies it that it came through our office. So it's something for you to consider once you do have something in place, or if you have something in place already, is to take credit for that translation, to take credit that it has gone through some sort of structured process to try to create and develop the best possible translation you can. So identification is helpful. Quality control and contract. So this refers to the instance where you have a contract in place for translation services. You have a vendor in place. Or you're going to rely on a vendor or rely on a contractor to do all your translation work. Do any of you work with any translation companies at this point for translation work?
Can you hear what he said? Okay.
No? Okay. So if you are considering working with a translation company for the acquisition of translation services in the future, it's important to identify a very good and qualified vendor. There's a wide range of translation companies out there, from global corporations that are based all over the world to your mom and pop shop down the street that happens to know a few people who speaks a few languages and does the translations for them, and everything in between. So it's important that you find the right partner moving forward. And to find the right partner, we have found that the best starting point is to start with a very solid and good RFP, or request for proposal. And this is something that city agencies typically have to go through to identify a vendor, is go through a process to get the best bidder, the best prices, and the best service for the price. So if this is something you're interested in, I can go into a little more detail real quickly, or I can go into a lot of detail if necessary. But I think that it's important to point out at least these 4 bullet points in starting this process, to make sure that the services that you are looking for from the translation company include stages of proofreading and editing. They need to understand that it's not just giving it to someone to translate and back to you, that you are also looking for someone who will not only have it translated, but reviewed by a second person, or even a third person, before it gets sent back to you. And these are the specifics that could and should be detailed in a very comprehensive request for proposal when searching for a vendor. Also, screening the expertise of potential translators. I'll use, again, the Department of Education here in New York City as an example. When we went through an RFP process, we wanted to make sure that the vendors had translators in place, not only in the languages we were looking for, but also with some sort of educational background, so that they were familiar with, for example, the special education process, that they were familiar with the English Language Learners Program, and things to that effect. It helps to have some expertise in the field. It's not a requirement or necessity, because that could be learned, but it's something you could screen up front as part of your RFP process. The other thing that is that is not well known outside of the translation industry is translation memory software. And this is a tool that is widely used in the translation industry. It's widely used by translation companies, and it's almost becoming a requirement for freelance translators to have as well. And how this works is translation memory software is, let me begin by saying it is not machine translation. There's a difference. Machine translation is what people refer to as, when you go to Google and you translate something. So the software will pick the words from a database and throw it at you and give you that. That's machine translation. Translation memory software is a little similar, but with a big difference. The big difference is that it's a database with terms, but it's built by human beings, and it's constantly being updated by human translations. So, for example, if I was given a sentence to translate, and the sentence was, the car is red, and I translated that into Spanish, the car is red. A month from now, if I got a sentence that said the car is blue, my system would tell me that all that I would have to do is change the word from red to blue, and that sentence would be done. This is a tool that ensures consistency, it ensures quality, and ultimately it reduces the cost because translation companies will charge you a lesser rate for text that is similar and that exists in their translation databases. Freelance translators will also charge you lesser rates because they're not reinventing the wheel every single time. They're just making revisions to existing translations. Then translation companies will give you different rates. They'll talk to you in terms of new text, which means that it's something that's not in the memory, so it's going to require full-blown translation. They're going to give you a rate for exact matches. So if the red car was translated 2 months ago and the red car comes up again now, they'll give you a reduced rate for that, or maybe even free. And then in between, there's a fuzzy match, which means, in my example of the red car and the blue car, they'll give you a reduced rate for only having to translate the word blue instead of red and replacing that. This is something that many translation companies they assume that you, the client, or government agencies are not aware of this tool, and they will charge you for the new word rate in every instance and will gain leverage and cost efficiencies internally by using the software. But if you bring this up as an issue in your RFP, they will be well aware that you're very knowledgeable in the field and that they will need to respond and give you rates accordingly, which makes your dollar go a lot longer in the process. Lastly, one of the things as well that it's not very well known is that a lot of translation companies should have errors and omission insurance. And what that means is that if there happens to be a translation problem or issue, for example, if you plan to mass print and produce a 10-page, highly formatted, nicely colored four-colored graphic brochure, and you're spending thousands of dollars printing this, and you're spending thousands of dollars shipping it to different locations, and after you produce the Korean version, a mistake comes up in the Korean translation where there's a huge error or omission, this is where this insurance kicks in. And this is where a translation company is responsible for covering all the costs involved and all the printing that you did, all the logistical distribution things that you went through. And this is something that many translation companies have, that at least the well-established companies have. And this will weed out those mom-and-pop shops that may not be who you're looking for when partnering for translation service to move forward. So having this errors and omissions insurance as a requirement in your RFP is critical, so that you know who the true players are and who's serious about providing the service that you look for. Okay. So and I don't think this applies to anybody in the room because I don't think you send out any work to vendors. But just a couple of tidbits on this. If you do have contractors already in place, or if down the road you go through the RFP process and you bring a contractor or a vendor on board, it's important to do these two things. It's important to continue to communicate and provide guidance and feedback to the vendor. In many instances, what I've seen is that there's never anything good to say about a translation company. All I always hear is, oh, they always commit mistakes. They're always, they're always committing errors. The reason they're always committing mistakes and errors is because we're not telling them to change things. So if we don't like the way they're translating hospital, and they keep on translating hospital a certain way, and we continue to fix it, it becomes very frustrating. But if we tell the vendor, don't translate hospital that way, translate hospital this way, they'll make the change. But without that guidance and feedback, they will not make that change. So it's something to keep in mind, is to always have open means of communication with your vendor and to let them know what changes or corrections you want them to make, and they're glad to do so. If you happen to be in a situation where there are multiple contractors in place, so it could be that you have 2, 3, 4 different vendors in place, there are means and ways to measure their performance and to evaluate their performance so as to get them to almost to compete with one another to give you the best service possible. And there's a lot of information behind that. Won't get into too much detail there. Sorry, did someone have a question? No? Okay.
No.
All right, so lastly, just the last few suggestions or recommendations that you may want to take back with you. If nothing else was relevant, a couple of these things might be helpful in moving forward. Additional to-do lists that you can take with you. The first time, collect list of documents produced by all internal offices. This kind of goes back to the idea of creating a list of critical documents, or coming up with the different categories that we talked about, whether it was the frontline documents, the seasonal documents, the websites. Take a look and see what are we talking about? I mean, how many documents, how many different offices in your building are there? How many of those offices actually produce publications? And how many of those publications actually need translation? If these publications are for employees, you don't need to translate it. You probably don't need to translate it. But if they're meant for the general public, those are the ones you want to identify. Inquire whether any documents have already been translated and into what languages. I've been in situations where there have been 2 to 3 different offices within one agency who have submitted the same document for translation. That means the right hand wasn't talking to the left hand. So it could be that some of these documents have already been translated and someone had them archived on their computer and just didn't share it with anybody, or just used it once and never again. It's interesting to find out what has been done, who has it, where are they stored, and whether or not they should be stored in a central location so that translations can be used by more than that one person. It can be used by the entire staff if necessary. The third point, identify and understand. Okay. One of the things that I found extremely helpful in many cases was to put myself in a position where I could identify every single entry point for a potential LEP contact. What that means is, does that mean that I can have an LEP individual walk into my office, call me on the phone, run into me at a public event? So in order to understand those types of interactions, it will help you develop a response to those interactions. And it could be that within the various internal offices within your organization that they have different means of contacting or communicating with LEPs. So it's important to understand how each one of your internal offices works in their relationship with LEP clients. And lastly, and I mentioned this several times earlier, is obtaining data on language preference and obtaining that information, because it'll make life much more simpler moving forward in terms of planning and projecting. One of the things that you can take a look at is try to find a point in the any process where this data could be obtained. Here at the Department of Education, we grab this data at the very entry point of our clients. For example, if a family is registering their child for the very first time in the school system, whether they be a kindergarten student or they move from out of state and the child is 6th grade or 10th grade, the parent needs to complete several documents, almost a mountain of paperwork. But one of those documents is related to language preference. And it's at that point where we grab that information, and we then have systems where that information goes into. So think about where in the process, at your end, you could create a form and include a process to grab that data. If there is no process in place, if there is no good point to enter a document to grab that information. I have seen government agencies just randomly and proactively send out a communication to their clients asking them what their preference is. So next week, for example, you could send a letter or a form that's been previously translated to everybody in your service community and have them respond back in terms of what their preference is. Of course, you're going to have to have a system in place to grab that data and to put it into a system in order to make, to use that data and to report and to maneuver it and work. So that's the background to that. But do take a look at that and see whether or not there is a good point where that information can be obtained. All right, and with that, it brings to the end of this brief presentation. And I hope it was informative. I hope it was something you can take back with you and apply a couple of things to your settings. Any questions?
Actually, wanted to note that this webinar 1.5 minutes.
Oh, it does? Oh, yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
I was going to follow up the webinar 5 minutes, so I think we scheduled it to go from 8:45 to
10, yeah.
So, in the event that we have questions, anybody here have questions? I know I have one. Could we just email you and write the time messages?
Yeah, well, I can give them your email addresses, right? Yeah. So you can even call him. But do you want to ask him now? Your question?
My question is, I take long. It relates to, I have two blind friends, and the technology is kind of come a long way for them to redocument to OCR or screen readers and all of those. But I guess my question is, I think you can answer it a little bit. One was, what about like accessibility, ADA, Section 508 kind of stuff? Would that come about with like Braille, that kind of translation? Is it something that goes on the radar? And the second one is, where's the technology? And I know you talked about the translation memory software, but I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Karen, I seem to be able to hear you a lot clearer when you speak. I wonder if you can relay the question.
Maybe John, you should move. John has two friends that are blind,
yeah.
And he was talking about the technology. Do you address ADA issues when you do language translation? Is there like software for people who have disabilities or are handicapped?
So, okay, yeah. So there's two issues. There's individuals that are blind and individuals who require sign language interpreting.
Yeah.
Those services do not fall under our jurisdiction here in the translations unit. We have a separate special education division, and within that division, they provide services for both of those populations. And I know that there may be some technology out there, but I'm not the person to ask in terms of those services.
Okay. Did you folks have any other questions?
Was there a second question to that?
Is technology going to take over language translation and interpretation?
I think technology is going to help support it. I'm a firm believer that it will not replace a human translator. It will support it in terms of the translation memory software that I mentioned. On the interpretation side, I do see a lot more of visual conferencing of interpreters, but there's always a human element, and I don't see that ever going away.
What do you think about machine translation?
What's your opinion on machine translation?
So I've been posed this question many times in terms of machine translation, and it's the best way that I was able to convince individuals that it did not work was actually to have a piece of text translated into multiple languages and have linguists in those languages comment or do a back translation back into English. And once a monolingual English-speaking person read the back translation, they suddenly understood what I was trying to say in terms of the quality. Nevertheless, if we're talking about a simple letter, a simple structured sentence, and it's for informational purposes only that you're translating something, and what comes to mind is a short email. If with someone that you may have a good relationship with and you want it translated and just to get the gist of it, maybe it's fine. But anything beyond that, in terms of a communication that you're going to make public to the general public or to an individual on a very serious topic, it will not cut it.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question? Because it's not shutting down yet. Are you folks good? Okay. Everyone has to go back to work, but thank you so much, Kleber. We appreciate it. I'll let you know when we post your recording on the on our website.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, great.
Okay, thank you.